Let's see. I am on mute and I'm not because of the feedback. Okay. Still getting feedback. Somebody. Only one microphone should be on. If anyone else is logged in, mic's off. Hello. I am on mute here.
Still some feedback. You actually there's still feedback, and I just you log out. I logged out of my computer. But they recorded it. They recorded the MMRP. I think
How do you do this? Go away. I don't want this. I honestly don't want my picture. I don't know how to do this. Bill,
no, just
turn on reactions. Use the hand gesture. Send. I don't want to do this. What the fuck is this?
You gotta turn it off and start over again.
Turn what off?
Application that you're in.
Why?
Zoom. Like the historic schoolhouse where the meeting is happening is muted and that lady.
Full house is muted. But it seems fine.
But there's no sound. Could you help me, please? I ask you this. I ask you this.
I was in the middle of something. I'm still in the middle of something, but it stopped.
Playing games.
Yeah, well, we do that too. And we don't like to be interrupted either.
Could you tell me what to do?
Video off. Turn the video off.
What is that? It's hearing me.
Early by some of our regulars.
I'm walking to Bob's and back,
Okay.
then I'll do a longer walk.
George, two quick thoughts, if you can hear me. One is, I think you need to mute everyone for starters, because we clearly have people who are inadvertently leaking audio. Second, I think the echo might be potentially because someone in the audience has their audio on, assuming you've checked everybody on the podium. So that's just two thoughts. Okay, well, you're still on mute and no one's getting any audio from you.
Run all that centrally here, and as you can see, things get rather fraught when that gets out of control. So we're going to start discussing our financial emergency. First point I want to make is it's good to see so many people are interested in turning up. That's a very good thing. So I'm glad we worked through the technical issues. This topic may consume the entire meeting again. We continue to hold over the audit memorandum of internal controls from a couple meetings ago, and we'll see if we get to that. But this is really the most important thing. To commence, after I make a couple introductory remarks, I want to hear from Tony on our status. And then I want to spend some time really digging into the expense side in greater detail. Mark Wacer is asked to present a few slides on that topic, and we'll do that. We'll also consider revenues. I've seen some comments from members of the public that they're wondering why the revenue mix is slimmed down in recent meetings. We have discussed all of them available, but as you'll see today, our options under state law in terms of what can be enacted and when are rather limited, and we'll get into specifics on that. Just want to open by pointing out that spending has gone up quite a bit, and this is sort of an example, a negative one of the power of compounding. Over the last 5 years, revenue has increased by 37%, which is great, right? Which is a compound annual growth rate of 6.4%. But meanwhile, total spending has increased quicker, 52% for a compound annual growth rate of 8.8%. So just a 2.4% differential in annual growth makes a very big difference when added up over a few years. And of course, we were blind to the impact of the general fund on this because of our accounting issues, which we're resolving, but the lack of proper accounting on that level, which is, we're working to get through audits and that sort of thing. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. We'll also talk about some revenue things as well. A big component that you'll hear about from the expense side over the last few years has been our housing element and related expenses. Expenses that are going up now and going forward that create a structural problem for us are the sheriff's contract. Somebody online is unmuted, making a lot of noise.
Telephone number.
It's from a telephone number. Yeah,
7562.
7526, please mute your
7562.
line. Yeah, 7562. Yeah, sorry. Thank you. So we're really going to dig into that, but I mentioned that the sheriff's contract is starting to bite and will be going up approximately $200,000 a year every year for the next several years. So that is something that we need to factor into our discussion of how to make expense and revenue connect. Another point that I want us to think about is whether we might charge our housing element related expenses to our affordable housing fund. Because from my naive reading, the entire purpose of the RHNA process and all of the housing element work is to increase the supply of housing in Portola Valley and California more generally to create more affordability in housing, both subsidized and below market and market housing. And so just wondering whether an appropriate use of our housing fund, affordable housing fund, might be supporting the planning and development efforts that we have been involved in over the last several years for housing. So that's something I'm hoping everyone can think about a little bit. Then we'll hear from the committee. I'd like to make some recommendations today, I think, at the end for the town council to think about, because time is not our friend on this status. And with that, by way of opening remarks, I'd like to hand it to Tony for just an update on our situation.
Our situation pretty much hasn't changed much since our last meeting. We are still reviewing some of the numbers. And so what's going to be presented at the council meeting on the 23rd, the proposed expenditure numbers might change from today through next week. But I want to share the last spreadsheet. This is the spreadsheet that has our forecast. And I've got built in 3 scenarios that we can review and discuss and make changes as we go along. I want to show the chart at the bottom here. Okay. So with what's being proposed currently for the 24-25 revise, and based on revenue projections, if things stay status quo, we're looking at the general fund's surplus or the reserve going into a negative by fiscal year 28-29. But you know, regardless, the reserve is below the 60% reserve policy. So the immediate action is what can we do to keep the reserve from going below 0 and actually start building reserves over the next few fiscal years. Keeping in mind that there are some expenses that we have no control over, but there are some discretionary expenses that we can. And then the revenue is based on historic projections, based on growth. So looking at the 24-25, which is this column here. Revenues are projected to be 7.3 million, which is a slight increase from what was proposed. Basically, it's an increase in our property tax revenue based on projections, revised projections received from Paula Cone. And then also looking at some of the fees, we've updated some of the fees as well. On the expense side, we're currently projecting expenses to be about 7.76 million and transfers out of 400,000, but those numbers can be changed. And looking at salaries, those numbers are including some salary savings that we're receiving from vacant positions. But that number with the, we're looking at recruiting a new town manager. So those numbers might actually be increasing upwards as we're looking at consulting firm and hiring a new town manager. There's also, we need a town clerk, and we also need a town engineer, and those recruitments are ongoing. So that number could change from time to time. Also, the benefit number will also be impacted by the actual salaries as we go through this process. We're still looking at our services and supplies. We can probably find some additional savings there. And then looking at our contractors or recurring contractors. And the recurring contractors are the folks who provide the plan check services, building inspections. We could look at reducing some of their hours over the next few months so that can reduce the costs there. And then we still have some one-time consultant costs. I still have Krish Company for a small amount this year. And but looking at the Mays and Associates, which is a recurring contract, our auditor, next fiscal year, that amount for the contract will be reduced about $100,000. So we've identified some savings there for moving forward to next fiscal year. So right now, we proposed a $2.9 million deficit in the budget, but we're revising that number to be a little bit before 900,000. We did reduce the transfers out by about $900,000 for capital projects that we're going to defer. So as of right now, projecting the fund balance to be 694,000 by the end of 24-25, which is June. And then looking into
Patients and careers at risk. Rubric provides the
okay. So looking at 25-26, again, if things stay the same and we move forward with the proposed expenditure reductions in 24-25 and putting in some growth factor, we're looking at having a balanced budget for 25-26 with revenue of 7.5 million and total expenses of 7.4 million with transfers out of 125,000. And now I'm including the 125,000 because there are some operating expenses that we have to transfer over to the gas tax fund to fund those operations. It's basically a match for gas tax operations. It's required by the state of California. When we do our annual streets and roads report, we have to show that we actually have some skin in the game in regards to our streets and roads through the general fund.
And Tony, can I ask you just for a moment to do an aside for those listening who are unfamiliar with municipal accounting and what a transfer out means
Yes.
in our general fund versus everything else?
So fund accounting, we have several funds that are self-supporting balance sheets. And so if the gas tax is producing expenses on behalf of the general fund, we transfer funds from the general fund to gas tax. And it's also with, we have a capital projects fund. So we have capital projects, they're funded through the capital projects fund. And we transfer funds from the general fund to the capital projects fund to fund those projects. We have other capital project funds, the restricted funds like Measure A, Measure M, Measure W, gas tax, those are all used for transportation projects. We have the open space fund, which is a restricted fund. We have the affordable housing fund, which is a restricted fund. So if there's any transfers out and transfers in, they have to balance out zero. But predominantly for the general fund, any transfer out is going to be for operating costs in the gas tax fund and any capital project fund. And it's just moving funds from the general fund to those respective funds.
Tony, can you just, for first timers,
Uh-huh.
clarify the magnitude of the contribution to the deficit from the sheriff's contract?
Well, from 2021, we spent 1.1 million in the sheriff's contract. And we're going to spend 1.68 million out of the general fund of the 1.9 million total of the sheriff's contract. So that right there is almost a $600,000 increase just from the sheriff's contract alone. Over the fourth fiscal, and then it's going to go up 200,000 next year, and 200,000 a year.
So
next.
roughly 500,000 for next fiscal year, increasing in $200,000 increments going forward,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And I believe also last time you pointed to within that services line that there were an increase in legal fees.
Yes.
And can you give an order, like a rough estimate on increase in legal fees?
Right. So in 21, 22 was $157,000. 23, 24, it's going to be $434,000.
All right, so just round numbers, we're talking about $500,000 attributable to sheriff's contract and 250,000, sorry, attributable to legal fees.
Right. And also with the use of the consultants for the housing and safety element, there was exponential increase. We had 83,000 in 21, 22, or 2021, and we had 423,000 in 23, 24.
Okay,
And Tony,
thanks.
does that include the town attorney that I have in the numbers at around 245,000? Does that, the legal expense, does that include or exclude the town attorney?
For planning division, that excludes town attorney.
Okay, yeah, so town attorney is on top of that.
Right.
Tony, I'm sorry.
But
Can you,
not all the town attorney's costs were attributed to the housing. I mean, there's also for regular time for the meetings and other town associated work.
can you give me the housing element costs again, please?
In the planning division, the housing element cost increased from 83,000 to 423,000. That was, well, it was 83,000 in 2021, and it was 408 in 21, 22, 621 and 22, 23, and then 423,000 in 23, 24. So over that span, it was 1.5 million total in miscellaneous consulting costs, but not all of that was for the housing element. There were some other projects that they were doing, but about 1.1 to 1.2 million I'm estimating to be for the housing and safety.
Tony, just to clarify, you said the sheriff's contract, we know for sure it's only going to go up 200,000 for the next 2 years?
Yes, it's going up to 2.3 million, but we received credits last fiscal year, this fiscal year, next fiscal year to keep it below the 2, but eventually it's going to get to 2.3 million.
I'm sorry, so what year is that?
So for 23, 24, the total cost of the contract is 1.9 million. But we received a credit of 403,000. So it's 1.5 million to the general fund. And then 24, 25, with the credit, we're going to get 1.9 million total. We're going to spend 1.7. Well, we originally were going to spend 1.78 million. but we're moving an additional $95,000 to the COPS grant fund to offset some of that cost. And we've been offsetting the cost of the contract to the COPS grant fund of 160,000 per year, but we're going to increase that to 255. And we're going to see if we can maintain that amount that we receive COPS grant funding every year.
So, I'm sorry, so 23-24 net was 1.5, 24-25 was 1.7,
Mhm.
and then 25-26, is there a fixed
Going
number?
to be about 1.89, 1.9,
Okay, and then after that, they can charge us anything?
2.1,
Uh,
and then
I'm
it's going
sorry.
to be, then we're going to possibly read it, because I think it's a 3-year cycle that the sheriff's contract was negotiated. But it's 1-year increments.
I'm sorry, so 26-27, you're saying will be a new contract?
That's, if we don't get a credit, it's going to be about 2.3 million.
I'm sorry, and
The cost of the general funds, the other parts are going to
Oh.
be 2.5. Or the other amount I charged to the COPS grant fund.
okay, and the credit, is that from the COPS funding?
No, the credit was from the county.
Okay, okay.
And it expires, and we would have to somehow negotiate another credit with them or redefine the services in the contract to reduce the cost.
So we've had the COPS fund for quite some time now.
Yes, was Prop 172, blanking on, it was in the 90s, I believe.
Yeah.
It was a result of ERAF. And so it's a 0.5 cent sales tax measure for the state. So they increased the state sales tax. And from that program, we received funding for 2 funds, public safety augmentation, we get like 20 grand a year. And the COPS grant was started by the state legislature, I believe in 96 or 97. And we receive a good portion from that. It's a grant, and we can use it for frontline services and the sheriff's contractors.
Right. We've used that for many, many years now.
We've used it for
about
many, many-
$200,000, as I recall.
Yeah.
So what we really need to know is what the total cash that the town, not just the general fund, is being charged by San Mateo County Sheriff's Office. Because that's what needs to be covered. Just because we get COPS fund, the fund part of it, doesn't change the fact that we still have this cost, because we've always had fund.
Correct.
COPS fund.
Right, so from 2021 to 23-24, total cost of the contract was $6 million. Of which 5.3 million was charged to the general fund. And for 23-24, we did use about $400,000 of ARPA funds, which we no longer have available.
That's why I'm worried about just using the numbers that show up in the general fund.
But right now, the general fund's paying the bulk and will be paying the bulk of the sheriff's contract.
That $6 million number was for what period?
From 2021 through 23-24.
Maybe this is a good time. Mark, you were interested in making a presentation on something to do with expenses?
I was, and I sent that to you. Is there a way to present? I have physical copies, but I'm not sure what the protocol is.
Oh, okay. I thought you
Yeah.
would be presenting that. I'm sorry.
Let me stop share.
And it's beyond just expenses. It's really a lot of the work that, that I did a bit independently to frankly try to figure out how property taxes work. And there is, and I do have some perspective, but I wanted to. All right. Sent it yesterday afternoon, because I met with Tony yesterday to confirm the numbers in the presentation.
Yep.
I sent it to you yesterday.
I will find it.
Okay. So here, and then here, if you would mind passing, let's see. that. Am I taking one? Yeah, what's that?
I take one, right?
Yeah, you take one, pass it down. Just let me know when I'm ready to, and I don't think I'm not going to take more than 15 minutes. Yeah, so that, so if it's presenting and all of you have a physical copy. So I just wanted to start with the mission of the Finance and Audit Committee, which is fundamentally to review and recommend to the town council the budget and the annual financial statements. I just want to, and then, and anything else, which we're going to be talking about now. But in terms of the central function, particularly around the financial statements, I think that as a body here, we're not going to add a ton of value by reviewing the financial statements. And the reason is that the financial statements, I do believe, particularly led by Tony and his team, are going to be properly prepared, and they're going to be reviewed according to GASB, the General Accounting Standards Board, which actually have a narrower set of decisions that managers can make, as opposed to FASB, which most of us in the private sector are very familiar with. The decision set around GASB is somewhat narrower, and the auditors that we have are very well known. They audit a bunch of other municipalities around us. I think the bigger value add that we have is working on the budget. What I have found in the relatively short time that I've been on this council is that it's a little confusing to me as to how we actually review the budget, how we actually talk about the budget, and then feed comments back to particularly the town council, who ultimately is the one making the decisions around what the budget is. And it's really a reflection of a set of priorities. And this is something I think Chris Rittler said very well a number of meetings ago around the budget should present a set of priorities. And this fundamentally is around trade-offs. What I'm really focused on here is that I do believe, just looking at the calendar for what is taking place, is that the town council is set to meet next Wednesday, the 23rd, and then there's a separate closed session scheduled for the 30th. My guess, I don't know for sure, my guess is that it's really around two objectives. One is to actually declare a financial emergency or a fiscal emergency, which in my opinion is a mechanism to really try to put through new taxes. And then the second is to adopt a budget. Actually, what Tony just shared with us is actually the first balanced budget, not for this year, but for the next fiscal year that I think we've seen. But none of us, at least I'll speak for myself, haven't had a chance to really look at all at what a balanced budget looked like. So turn the page. So I went to my very first town council meeting last week, and actually I've never been to a town council meeting, never been on Zoom for one, but I went to my first one not to say anything, just because I wanted to see how that very important, frankly, the most important deliberative body in our town, how they actually make decisions and how they communicate decisions. And importantly, how they actually get information around what the town subcommittees or our committees do. I saw that. What was interesting is that we actually have the town attorney summarize, I think, very well what we've been talking about for months now to the town council. In preparation for that, I'd also never looked at the materials really the town council looks at, but there was some very good public comment. And this is the first page that I'm showing here. I didn't do this. I actually, when I first saw the spreadsheet, which by the way, was the very first spreadsheet I'd ever seen from Tony, to actually, because if you look at OpenGov is a nightmare to look at. At least I can't look at it very easily. I try to plug in numbers. They don't seem to make a lot of sense. Tony was the first to actually put the budget on a spreadsheet that made sense. So I actually built my own little spreadsheet and I did my own little graphs. There's one of our town members who I don't know, his name is Ronnie Kaczynski. He did this for the town council, and I thought he did it a much better job than I did. And I thought that this was a really good starting place. Now, one thing that I would take I'll take a different perspective, George, than what you said in terms of the dramatic growth in the revenues for the town. This is not a business. This is a taxing entity. Significant increases in revenue means higher taxes. Fundamentally, I'd actually think that the citizens of the town would prefer to have lower taxes so that they could spend money on things like hiring people, building houses, or frankly, saving it, investing it, whatever. So but what this shows, and I think that this graphic shows probably better than any numbers do, how dramatic the general fund is. I would say though, that the black bars here is just the general fund, as was just described by Tony. There is other very significant funds. The single most other significant fund is the open space fund. I would say, to the extent that there's any open space committee members listening or here today, and I don't know who you are, spend it before you lose it. It is something that the citizens of this town voted to have open space funds. There's a dwindling number of parcels in town. They're not getting cheaper, and there's fewer of them. And it's now serving to be, in my opinion, a bit of a distraction to have over $8.5 million not used. That's one perspective. But this focuses really around the general fund. Turn to the next page, and actually Tony just shared this, although what's very beneficial to what Tony shared that was not available to us earlier is another right-hand column around what happens for the next fiscal year. I would say, and I would just start with any budgeting process, of which I think I'm like many of you on the council, on the committee, I've been through multiple budgeting sessions. The very first thing you look at is the buildup to revenue. The single most important part of it is our property taxes. I would say just last Thursday, the county sent to Tony something known as the levy letter. And this is for the current fiscal year in which we are in, 2024 to 2025. They sent to Tony their calculation as to what are the property taxes, both for secured property and unsecured property, that will be sent to the town. Now that number is $3.4 million versus the 3.9. The big difference, which is almost $500,000, is an estimate of what property sales are going to take place in town. One of the points that I made to Sharif in the very first meeting, because the town had that same, in my opinion, optimistic revenue assumption. I think that's not an appropriate conservative revenue assumption. I think that we should only be counting what is in the levy letter. That's it. If anything else comes, if interest rates drop, there's more transfer and sales of houses, fantastic. That's actually bonus. But right now, I do not think that we should be using a higher number than what is in the levy letter, because it means we're going to actually be committing expenses against uncertain revenue. So I think that that's actually dangerous. Going down, so one of the big things that's on this spreadsheet is this $3.8 million on the expense side, which is supplies and service. Just to let everyone know, because Steve Cassani and I were the expense reduction working group, we have that detail, not from this session, but from actually the June session. Tony, who is been the most transparent, the most responsive person in government I've ever dealt with, gave us that detail. It is a mind-boggling amount of detail. I would say, though, that there are no easy choices among reducing that 3.8 million, but I do think that it needs to be done. Other than the sheriff's contract, which is the biggest single item of that, let me just kind of give you a couple of other big ones. In the next 10 items beyond the sheriff contract result in over $1.7 million. And they are things like the town attorney at almost $250,000, software licenses, $250,000, the building consultant, $200,000. Then there's two categories of of fire safety, which is above and beyond what the taxpayers in this town pay to the Woodside Fire Protection District. It's fuel mitigation at $185,000, fire protection, and I don't know how that's different, at $120. So between the two, it's over $300,000. There's liability insurance, there's auditing, there's a planning consultant at $133,000. There's the housing element, which is I have in at least the estimate was 130, but it sounds like it's going to be higher than that. Anyways, those are some of the big categories, and those alone constitute 1.7 million. Then we get to obviously a dwindling general fund balance. So by the way, and if anyone wants what Tony sent to me and Steve, what is this very extensive detailed spreadsheet of what constitute that 1.8 or 3.8 rather, just ask me or Steve, or I'm sure that Tony even has an updated version of it. Okay, the next page, one thing that I thought would be very helpful is every single municipality in the county of San Mateo. This is a spreadsheet that I built. I wanted to just see, I was under the assumption that we were by far the smallest municipality in San Mateo County. It turns out we're not. The smallest is actually Colma. They have only 1,500 people. Interestingly, they have their own police force. So this next column shows whether that municipality has their own police force or not. And I think that's actually critically important as to whether the police, not only do they have their police force today, but whether they had it at the time that Prop 13 was implemented, because that was a critical time to actually set tax allocations. Then we have the property taxes and then other taxes. Then you can see what total revenue is. You can see that Colma, which is the smallest town in our county, they actually have very little property taxes, less than $1 million, but they have 18.6 million. Oh, by the way, these numbers, these are the budgets from this current fiscal year. These are not historical. This is exactly apples and oranges for what we're looking at. Now, what they have though is that they have a bunch of car dealerships, and they also have the Bay Area's largest casino, from which they earn over $4 million a year. Now, these kind of, enough, I'll just give you a couple of other examples along those lines. Another very small town that actually has a very similar property tax base as we do, which is Half Moon Bay. We have 3.9 million in property tax. They have 3.8, but they have significantly more in other taxes. Over half of those other taxes are from the Ritz-Carlton. It's something called a transient tax. I didn't know what a transient tax, like how can you tax transients? Well, you can if they're rich and they stay at the Ritz-Carlton. That constitutes over $8 million. That one hotel alone constitutes over $8 million for Half Moon Bay. Again, and it's also the biggest single employer in Half Moon Bay. Again, that's another policy question for the town council as to whether we want to convert the Stanford Triangle to a Four Seasons or something. My guess is no. Another one that I thought, just last little tidbit, Pacifica, wonderful surf town. Turns out that surfers like cannabis because they earn over $1 million a year in cannabis license for retail there. Again, another policy decision, but I would actually, I would think that we do not want a bunch of cannabis stores on Alpine. Okay, but what you see on this page though, that I did actually look at what the property taxes are to population. And then the one that is the most similar in composition is Woodside. But one of the key differences is that Woodside has a much higher property tax per population than we do. And I fundamentally do not know why. I have a feeling it's because they had that allocation higher set before the implementation of Prop 13. I'll go into a little bit later as to what I think some limitations that this town has in terms of the ability to actually increase the allocation from the collective property taxes paid among the citizens back to the town to run the town. So turn to the next page. So I wanted to really compare side by side the current fiscal year, the revenues and expenses for Portola Valley and Woodside. Now, it's very difficult to compare apples and oranges because the way they do their chart of accounts is different than the way we do. But I think I realize that this is a wall of numbers, but I do think that it shows pretty well how their revenue is composed and how ours is composed and how our expenses are composed and theirs are. A key difference, of course, is the bottom line is that they tend to run at a surplus, whereas we've been running at a very significant deficit for some period of time. I don't know why. I mean, it strikes, I used to live in Woodside. It strikes me as a pretty similar town in terms of, zoning and people who live there and all of that. I would say that one of the things that I did learn in the most recent town council meeting, though, is how the town council makes decisions. And this is not in any way to be critical. I have no idea whether if I were on the town council, I'd make decisions any differently. But Woodside they just implemented their master fee schedule in July 1st of 2024. They just spent $55,000, $60,000 for a consultant to do that. The town council decided last week to spend 9 months and $66,000 to do the exact same thing. There was some discussion as to, well, can't we just adopt it? I mean, that's just one example, but these one examples, they build on each other. They build on each other to the point then that you're in deficit spending. Then I'll just kind of go, and then we already spent some time on this. The biggest single line item on the expense side, other than salaries and benefits, is the sheriff contract. It's shown here at 1.7. Actually, we just went through the numbers. Actually, Tony sent me a very helpful little spreadsheet that I could send around that actually breaks out, Michelle, exactly what you were asking for. But just to point out that then this is the GF stands for general fund. The general fund, the amount to be allocated to the general fund by the 2026-27 year is 2.1 million, with the other amounts being paid primarily through this COPS fund. Anyway, so that's that. Turns, yeah. Well, that's a good question. They don't say sheriff specifically. They just have safety services at 4.7 million. I tried, you can find the sheriff contract for Portola Valley on our website. I tried desperately to find it on the Woodside. I cannot find it. I think my guess is that it's something like 4.7. I don't know, other people may know, but I was unable to find it. I looked and I was unable to find it. Okay, next page. So then something that is, I really wanted the next page. I really wanted to figure out how much do our citizens in our town, our tax, how much do we pay to the county and how much comes back to us? I heard the very first thing that when I joined the council, George suggested that I watch the Paula Cohn presentation. Anyone who's interested in this somewhat arcane subject should absolutely watch it. She is a pro. And I learned a lot and I've watched it multiple times now. This is a confirmation what she told us in March. But I'll just go through it quickly. I spent a ton of time on this because I had to build my own database. By the way, if anyone is interested in that database, you can see what neighbors have not paid their taxes yet. You can see what your neighbors pay in taxes. It's kind of an interesting set of data. There are 1,762 parcels in Portola Valley. Those are all considered secured property within the town limits. I actually thought that Scott McNeely's house was going to be the top getter. Turns out he's just outside property town limits. There are of those, and this is back to the comment to the Open Space Committee, there's only, as best I can tell, 168 that are essentially undeveloped and pay very little or no taxes. Therefore, the tax-paying entities that pay over 1,500 a year, there's about 1,600 approximately. The total aggregate, and this is for this current, so like when you get your secured property bill from Sandy Arnott, in aggregate, we as a community pay 48.1 million. We receive back, according to the levy letter, and this is, by the way, the levy letter had both secured and unsecured taxes. This is just the secured portion, 3.24. Just so what that quotient is 6.7%. Not quite the 7% that I think we're supposed to be, nor the 6.9% that Paula Cohn said we should be, but it's kind of close enough, at least this is my calculation. The low in town is 1,564. The high, which is a spectacular property that was just sold the last couple of months for over $26 million. That's where you get the 1%. The mean is 30,000. The median is 24,000. For those of you who study statistics, I also did put this into a histogram. It is a right skew histogram. As you would imagine, when the mean is higher than the median, it is a right skew histogram. Okay, I wanted to compare that to the US median average. So therefore, we're only focused on median, not mean at this point. The US average property tax is 1,800. Again, Portola Valley, the median is 14 times that at over 24,000. The California average is over 5,000. Despite Prop 13, California is still among the very highest average property taxes in the country. And it's not because of the rate. The rate is about average at about 1%. It's because the property values continue to go high despite the 2% increase max every year. To change any of this, how do you change any of this? The section that Craig Taylor and I talked about briefly with one of the managers, the division managers in the county, you have to go through the Board of Equalization because they're the ones who are charged with overseeing the assessment practice and the allocations, or you have to challenge it in court. Now, I don't know the exact details, but something that Dave Cardinal actually put in PV Forum. I'm not on PV Forum, but my wife is. She knows I'm interested in this stuff. She said, hey, Dave Cardinal did this really interesting research. She sent it to me, and then I read it. It's kind of mind numbing, but the outcome is that 20 years ago, the mayor, Steve Tobin, went through this process and actually was successful to get an increase in the tax equity allocation from the town. Not only was he successful for the town, he was actually successful for a number of other towns in the county as well. My assessment is that for us to significantly increase the amount coming back to us to run the town, I think it would be very difficult. It's already been done 20 years ago. My sense is that it's probably, even if we can do it, it's going to be very challenging and laborious and time consuming to do so. And I'm not sure if that's going to be worth it. Last page, I'll just leave with 3 observations and 3 recommendations. This is my point of view. And I'm not, by the way, I'm not looking to try to convince anybody. I just simply want to share my observations and perspective to the extent that it's helpful to anybody. I'm not looking to advocate for any particular position. I believe that Portola Valley does not have a structural deficit. A structural deficit is Social Security. Social Security was in a structural surplus for the first 85 years of its existence. We flipped into a structural deficit. That's not this town. This town, actually George's point earlier, has radically increasing revenues because of an increasing tax base. We have managed to have even more dramatically increasing expenses. The combination of, and if you're interested in this, there's this very good data gatherer called the Tax Foundation, and they do tax assessments over every single county in the nation. This is where I get my data. The combination of state and local taxes, the combination of property taxes, income taxes, and consumption taxes in this county are the single highest in the entire country. The only one that comes close is Marin County. The other thing that I would say, if we are actually in this meeting considering recommending to the town council to try to get higher taxes, I would urge the finance committee to look at the 3 most recent referendums or asking the voters to do anything with the UUP. In 2006, I got my data from Ballotpedia, except that they don't go all the way back, but I know that it passed. 2006, special election to lower the UUT to 4.5%, keeping intact and sacrosanct the 2% that goes to the open space. I don't know how by what amount that it passed, but I know that it passed. 2009, there was an election that asked the voters to continue to read the reduction to the UUT from 5.5% to 4% for 4 more years. That passed by 83%. 2013, another ballot measure asking the voters to continue that reduction of UUT from 5.5% to 4.5%. That passed by 86%. So I just want everyone to keep that in mind if we are going to be trying to ask or even recommending to the town council to suggest to raise taxes in any way. The last point on observation is I believe that being an incorporated town, the original purpose of the town was to keep the special nature of the town, the rustic, rural nature of the town. I think that it's been largely successful in doing that. What it has resulted in, I think, is that it means that we have been charged in the past, and we will continue to be charged in the future to the extent that we continue to be a town of being double charged for sheriff services. I don't see any other way around it. We're charged when we pay property taxes. We're charged when we have the contract going back with, there's not an offset that I do think that that's the case. The other thing that I do think it is the case of being what a town is that the California housing element, with the first cycle of which started in 1969, I think being a town does not serve us well in that case, because the housing element laws have significantly increased these regional housing needs allocation from 64 units in the 5th cycle to 253 in the 6th cycle. The way the laws are written, as I read them, is that it allocates these RHNAs to 2 jurisdictions. They are the counties and their municipalities. There's, I think, 57 counties in the state. There's something like 300 cities in this or municipalities in the state. That's the way that gets allocated. If we were not a town, we would not get allocated. Those allocations would be at the county level. And my sense is that more reasonable decisions would have been made around putting those RHNA allocations closer to infrastructure that makes sense, specifically the Caltrain corridor. This is my perspective. Recommendations, 3 observations and just 3 recommendations, and thank you for your patience, is that I think that the town council, if going back to the purpose of this committee, which is to recommend for adoption to the town council the budget. My perspective is that we should recommend to the town council to adopt the balanced budget and do it for this year. Not deficit spending. The deficit spending has frankly gone on for too long. It can be done. They are not easy choices, but it has to be done by reducing outside consultants and contractors. And again, that is, and it's something that I think that the way it should work is that we recommend to the town council, if the town council believes that that's the case, that the town should run on a balanced budget, then the town council needs to instruct the town manager to actually put forward a balanced budget. I think that we have a bunch of very thoughtful people that were very willing to work on that. I do not want to tax Tony and his team further. The second is no new taxes. Not only do I'm antithetical from a principle perspective against higher taxes, already having paid the highest taxes in the country. I think that it's not likely to be effective. I don't think it's going through the exercise of trying to get higher taxes in this town. I think is going to be a fruitless, expensive, time-consuming exercise. And the last thing I'll say, other than one other point, is that I do think that it does make sense for the town council to decide whether it makes sense to going forward to be a town council. I have my emotion. I love this town. My wife and I came here almost 10 years ago. We built our adult house. We want and we expect to live here for the rest of our life. We love this town. That said, I wonder, however, if being a town with the way central decision-making to Sacramento has gone in the last 40 or 50 years, I do wonder if it's become counterproductive to what makes this town special. That's not a decision for us to make. That's a decision for the town council to make, but it is a thought that has crossed my mind. I don't think it's going to, well, anyway, I'll just leave it there. Let me just give you with one last risk. I do see risk. As I mentioned in the last meeting, I have worked with these last 6 months with Tony, as I'm sure you have too. I think he's a spectacular professional. The biggest single risk I think I see from a financial perspective is that Tony goes back and forth between Salinas and here every day. He's got to spend over 3 hours in the car every day. Between now and some point in the future, there will be another town that will have an opening for finance director. And I would not blame Tony one bit if he takes that job. If he takes that job, frankly, we're going to be in even a worse spot. The last point I'll make is that a number of years ago, I ran a fund management company where it was a private partnership. And we took an investment from a publicly traded company that made investments in GP positions. As a part of that, we had to do, they were a publicly audited company, as a publicly traded company. They insisted, understandably, that all of their underlying managers be also publicly audited. We therefore had to do in 1 year, we had to do 3 audits. The very first thought I had was, well, we got to go pay E&Y or some consultant to do that. The chief financial officer came to me and said, no, why don't we do it ourselves? Because we need to build these skills anyway. So we put in place a bonus program to actually have 3 audits done in 1 year. It was done better, faster, cheaper than paying for consultants. One thing that I do not think has happened, I don't think that the town council has actually considered, or if they have, I'm unaware of it, of actually putting in place a similar bonus structure for Tony and his team. Because if we're asking people to do 3 years of work in 1, that is something that I think I would advocate paying for. And that's something that I think, to the extent that and it's not something, I know that Tony's not going to advocate for himself in that way, but it is something that I do think about. If it's critical to get audits for the town, 3 years, 3 in 1 year, it is something that I think might make sense, as opposed to paying, a town manager who didn't really work out over $90,000 in severance, or, whatever it is. And then all of the other legal fees that it took to actually even get to that settlement. I think something like that, I think that would be something I would be advocating to maybe think about putting into the budget if we do want to go that way. Thanks very much. I know I went over 15 minutes. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Mark. Just a quick question on the tax rate. You mentioned we get 6.7%. The 0.3% by my calculation is about $230,000 a year, which is not nothing. I'm just wondering, it really looks like 6.7%?
That's, the answer is yes, and it's a pretty simple math.
Yeah.
The numerator is what we get from the levy letter, and actually I can send you the levy letter.
Great.
We just got it. That's the numerator. The denominator comes from my database.
Mhm.
I built that database. I tried to actually, I'm a horrible coder. I tried to do a data scraper to actually, I did it by hand. There may be a fat finger number, but I actually don't think so. I actually double, triple checked it. I actually checked it with Paula Cohn's numbers.
Okay.
If you want to see my database and, yeah, you're welcome to it. So that's where I get the denominator for that quotient.
Yeah, it's just interesting to think about going forward, which is, given AB, I think it was 1197, the Tax Equity Act, way back when, requires us to get up to 7%. We're always usually just a little bit below in the not worth arguing range, but that would be more significant.
It's close enough to 7 for the county.
Yeah, and what you mentioned about, I'll just give you my comment on the disincorporation as a town. It is ironic that the very reason Portola Valley was created, which was to prevent the county from permitting mass development of the hills, so we could control development, is now under the RENA process used against us systematically by assigning housing units not on the basis of topography or transit rails or whatever, but on the basis of municipal boundaries. And of course, Palo Alto has both rail lines and beautiful hills, and they put the affordable housing near the rail line where it makes sense. And we only have beautiful hills, and we need to figure out how to do it here. My only concern there, though, is that by transferring authority to San Mateo County, I can't be sure that people in San Mateo County won't just say, well, you have lots of open space, so we're going to put it there. So anyway, food for thought. Any more comments on what Mark just said? Or also Tony and topics? This is open to the entire financial matter.
Well, there's still some items I want to go over.
Oh, there are.
Especially-
Okay,
yeah.
I'm sorry about that. Please continue.
Yeah, so I didn't kind of go over the reset and the restructure of the budget.
Okay.
Are there any public comments allowed?
I'm sorry, what's that?
We've been an hour. Are there any public comments allowed, or we wait to the end of what Tony
Well, we're
said?
hoping to wait to Tony finishes and then the committee members get to talk about it, and then we'll certainly do that.
Okay,
This is
thank you.
just a long topic. Sorry.
Yeah, so moving on for the, looking at the expenses for 25, 26 and some of the items currently under consideration. We're going to be looking at cuts, and on the budget for 24, 25 proposed 20 FTEs. But we've immediately
49.
we immediately froze 2 positions, so that's 18. And we currently have about 4 or 5 vacant positions. The 25, 26 budget will probably look at 15 FTEs. So that's a reduction of 5 employees. It could be a combination of just if an employee leaves, we just leave it, we freeze the position, we don't fill it, or we eliminate the position altogether if it's not filled. Subsequently, that should reduce the benefits. We're also looking at about a $300,000 reduction in supplies and services. But on the flip side, some of those cost savings are going to be eaten up by the increases in the sheriff's contract. So the 25, 26 budget is going to be about 7.4 million in expenses, which should create a surplus of about 133,000. But we got the 125,000 to the gas tax. It was, I know we've talked about it, George, but we just can't seem to get around that. If we have gas tax expenses in any given year, we're gonna have to do some type of general fund transfer for the operation side. So the assumption we'll do 125,000, those transfers for each fiscal year through 29-30. And then there's assumption factors, 3% growth for salaries, 7% for benefits. And the benefits not only include the retirement for PERS, but it's also medical, dental, and vision. And medical premiums have been going through the roof over the last 4 years. Next year, it's going to be an 11% increase in premiums. But for a budget, since it goes into effect January 1st, I take half of that increase and plug that into the budget. But then I also add an additional percentage for any increases in PERS. And then on the, but yeah, I just wanted to include those, talk about costs and TOT, it's transient occupancy tax. Transient occupancy means you're in the town for less than 30 days. And so, yeah, hotel, any city or town that has a hotel has a TOT. Next time you're down at Disneyland, check out your receipt. You see the TOT at the bottom. It's probably one of the highest in the state because they've got hundreds of hotels. So, but yeah, the Ritz-Carlton in Half Moon Bay would be a big contributor to that. The city of Scotts Valley has the Scotts Valley Hilton. It's got the Four Point Sheraton. Also has, it's called 1440 Multiversity. It's a corporate retreat, educational. When I was working for Scotts Valley, we had no idea what it was when they proposed it and built it until we started seeing the TOT coming in, and we're like going, we love this because it quickly became the second highest TOT generator in the city. It was absolutely fascinating. So something to consider for the town of building a retreat center, something that's similar.
Does that require a charter town status as well, or is
No,
that
you just
general
create
law?
a TOT. I mean, you would pass an ordinance. It'll be a vote. You want to, because TOT, they go from 10%, 12%, 14%. Cities down in the Monterey Bay area, they always struggle with, we don't want to pay more than 10. But Marina came on board, said, no, we're gonna go to 14, and then everybody had to catch up. So.
Any idea why a real estate transfer tax requires a charter, but a TOT doesn't? Is it just one of those things?
Well, yeah, because we want to set the transfer tax at a different rate than what a general city can.
Oh, I see. So there is a range that a
Yeah.
general city's allowed
Yeah.
for these taxes, including.
For a
the
property
TOT.
transfer tax, yeah, but for a TOT, it's at any city or town that has a hotel. That's, you have to have them, so.
Okay,
Yeah.
got
But that's a general tax, so it'll just go on any statewide general election.
Hear that? Having hotel, it's just cashed out.
What is?
A hotel.
There we go. More stuff from you, Tony?
No, that will be it for me.
Okay. Committee members, let's talk about this.
My question is, I want to know clearly what the town council wants from us and when they want it. I listened to the recording from last week. They're kind of on a fast train to some decision, and I don't think we've made our priorities and choices and advice, and they may not be the same among all of us. I don't think they know what they are. I think it's been I wouldn't say dysfunctional, but it hasn't been helpful that we meet on a critical item like, the fiscal management and what we do. We meet separately. I have to find out what the town council is thinking by sitting on my computer and trying to navigate a recording. We have one member from the council who sits through our meetings. We don't have recordings of our meetings. Our meeting minutes are very summary. I don't think they have a very good understanding of the things we've discussed and what we think. And I think we're kind of in the same position. I think.
I'll just
in very
correct one thing. There are recordings of our meeting up on YouTube.
Okay. My point is, I don't think we're working the way we need to with the town council. What I suggest we consider, and maybe this, George, is what was going to happen next week. Joint meeting, town council, finance committee, as many members as want to attend. And we spent an hour and a half together talking about the alternatives, including the ones Mark has talked about, the value we get from our consultants, the tax option. And we talked directly to each other rather than through memos and listening to recordings. I just don't think we're moving fast enough to make a decision. More importantly, I think we'll make a better decision if we all know what the trade-offs are. So I think just as a procedural matter, I think that would be a very powerful way to go. I don't know the last time, in fact, we've ever had a joint meeting with them, but if there's a time when we ought to do it, this is now. They need to make some decisions. We ought to tell them what they think. They may accept most of what we say. They may reject it all. Fine. But it's got to be a very clear process. If I was, a member of the public right now, it doesn't look like we manage things very well. It looks like we lost control of things. We didn't have proper oversight of financial things. We're talking about doing some fairly radical things to them, either in terms of asking more taxes or cutting services. They're going to be unsettled, and it's going to look like we're getting tied up in our own underwear and not working together to solve the problem rather than talking endlessly about it. So, 2 to 3 weeks, we got to get nailed down. First of all, if we're going to have an election of anything regarding taxes or anything else, the deadline is December 6th. That's not much time. And, we've got holidays coming up and everything else. So my one recommendation for this meeting was next week, we have a joint meeting. I think there's still time to accomplish that. And then we can talk about some of the things I think we're going to say individually tonight, in addition to the suggestions Mark said.
Okay, that's really good. I want to hear from everyone on this and recommendations as well on what we should do. I was hoping to hear some recommendations tonight on what town council or what we may want to do. And certainly meeting together with the town council is a good idea if they're amenable, but that's up to them.
They're looking at me, so maybe you think I should speak next here.
Sure.
I'm concerned that when we start looking at FTEs and we say we reduce them from 20 to 15, that we're not talking about what other services that the residents are receiving. My assumption is that if you cut staff, you also cut services. If you cut the budget, you probably are cutting services. Maybe the services are too high already. I don't know. I'm not a consumer of a lot of the services of the town. And so my point is that just looking at the dollars or the people doesn't necessarily relate to how we should make a decision. We should make a decision based on the services that the public wants. That's my major concern here.
Other comments from other folks? I've got some points on that, which is, I agree with Ken. Clearly, any sort of budget cut needs to be accompanied by an activity cut. You don't just keep the same deliverables and have fewer people to do it, because then everyone will quit on you because it's impossible to succeed. So we have to look for activities to prune. I'm quite aware, though, that we are resource rich in aggregate. We have a lot of cash in the bank, but most of it is restricted for specific purposes, and expenses have gotten ahead of revenues for the last 3 years without observation. And we have a structural increase in expenses coming along at a very significant rate over the next several years because of the sheriff's contract that will further that imbalance even if we work to balance the budget. So I agree that we need to reduce expenditures, try to balance the budget. On the revenue front, I would think it would be useful to consider temporarily diverting the 2% open space UUT into the general fund. That would amount to about $400,000 a year. And right now, the open space fund is earning the same amount, about $400,000 a year in interest. So it's effectively an endowment at this point. This would be temporary, this idea, and that would help us succeed. As you all noted in the packet, one of the practical issues we have in considering the charter city option that would enable us to have a real estate transfer tax, which is more palatable, I think, for many than any increase in taxation. One of the problems with that is thanks to what happened in Bell, California in 2010, our ability to do that in an off-year election has been removed. The folks down there rather calamitously abused their authority. And so the state saw fit to reform things in such a way that we can't have an election except in a major statewide election year around charter city stuff. So we can't do that. So we need something that could get us through the next couple of years. A parcel tax is another temporary parcel tax way to do that. The difficulty is that requires a 2/3 majority to pass, which, given our financial house is still being straightened out, is quite a significant hurdle to consider. The advantage of a UUT diversion is it's not a tax increase, it's a redirection of where the money is going. Continuing, our general fund and having it kept together as a town government is a related purpose in terms of helping to preserve open space by preserving the town against all the various pressures being put on us from outside. And I also emphasize my prime recommendation, which is to consider charging back the HCD related, housing element related expenditures, if legally acceptable, to the Affordable Housing Fund, since all of those activities that we're required to comply with are related to creating affordable housing. So it's, that's the name of the fund. And those were the activities, and they came out of the general fund. That in and of itself would give us a $1.2 million cushion, which would give us much more runway to figure out the rest of the items in terms of the things Ken has described about the balance between services and expenditures in the general fund, as well as the need for any more significant revenue measures, tax increases, which are very unpopular, certainly with me as well, whether that's required or not. But our main issue right now is that our 3-year runway became shorter and shorter and now is looking very tight, not because of cash, but because of our general fund balance. And so if we could have more funds transferred back into the general fund, that would be a good thing, I think.
George, I'd like to follow up to what you said. First of all, I think when you're in this state, you have to have a balanced budget. And we as citizens of this city have to say, this is what we have to tolerate for the services because we're running out of money. We don't have the money to fund this. Structurally, the police department is charging us more, significantly more as a percentage of budget. And all of the housing element is much more expensive. So if you look at those two things, folks, we got to have a balanced budget, means cut back services. That's step one. You're running out of money, stop the bleeding. Number two, yeah, I mean, we're going to have to redirect revenue. And I'm not knowledgeable of all the legal implications of it. But I'm with you, George, redirecting UUT. Everyone's already paying it. It's no incremental taxes. Our open space fund has over $8 million in it already. We could redirect UUT of $400,000 a year. And I would really like to see us use this, it's called the Inclusionary and Move Fund, I think, to pay as much of these legal bills as possible that we're incurring to participate in the state's mandating UUT, right? And, I don't know, again, the state's actions that they can take on us, but I think we need to move boldly and start doing some stuff for ourselves rather than the state doing it to us. So pay for RENA with inclusionary and Lou, figure out how to get UUT redirected, balance our budget, and then we can ramp up services when our budget improves or our revenues improve overall. That would be my thoughts. So I think I echoed a number of things you said there, George.
Thanks.
George.
Yeah.
Just a note on the UUT, we won't be able to transfer all of it. The water UUT, there's some court cases ongoing that are limiting the use of water UUT, and in some cases are invalidating. There's some court cases down in Southern California. So if we do reallocate UUT from the open space, it's only going to be the energy and phone. So it'll be about 300 to 350,000 instead of the 400,000.
And help me with that, because aren't we collecting that on water now,
We are, yes.
but somehow
But-
touching it?
Right now, touching
invalidates
it is because it'll have to go through the Prop 218 process where you have to have 2 hearings and.
Oh, I see.
And drawing a blank on the term, but there's a process. And so right now, the League of California Cities is fighting
Okay,
these two are, so the town attorney was, yeah, let's not touch water. But the energy and telephone are hoping to be reallocated.
okay. Still, it's not nothing.
Right.
And, we've discussed in the past the notion of going to charter towns status, having a real estate transfer tax, and potentially you could dedicate that to a fund for the sheriff's contract perhaps. And so if they're going to be charging us more every year, at least we had a dedicated fund for that purpose, but that will take a couple of years. And
Correct.
so we need to be
Right.
able to have runway.
Right. And we won't get the full amount until,
Yeah, so
we'll
more
get,
like
we'll
3
get
years.
half of it.
Yeah.
If it passes in November,
If-
starting in January. It'll be the next fiscal year where we actually get the full.
Okay,
I have a question on the UUT while we're talking about it. The research I did indicated that you can now charge a UUT on internet service, but that we don't currently do that. Do you,
Correct.
Tony, know?
Our telephone ordinance, UUT ordinance is antiquated.
Yes,
It's still, in fact, it could be challenged by a telephone company and say your language is not up to date, but they don't.
so could we do that? I'd rather have that than
so
water.
my research tells me that internet service is now one of the things you can charge on UUT.
Right.
Or put the UUT tax on it.
Sure.
And that would be for the 6.5 or 5.5% that we currently have would now include a bigger base because
Mhm.
internet service is a fair percentage of your utilities, at least in my household. I guess it depends how big your house is.
Yeah, but it does. That's an additional tax, right?
Sure.
So you will pay that.
It's a
I will
tax.
pay that, you will pay that, she will pay that.
Right, and there's a
Right.
vote, and there would be a vote.
Okay, all right.
And it's a general tax, so it'll be 50 plus 1. Majority. Yeah,
have to
it's a
vote on
general,
it.
it's a general.
And incidentally, we keep saying the word reallocate the 2%. I looked this up. We looked at UUT a few years ago, back in 2018, so this committee did. We have 2 different taxes. It's not allocated. We have a 5.5%, which initially was
Right.
6.5, and when it was first put in place in 1985.
Mhm.
But it was reduced to 5.5%, and today it's 5.5%. We have a second tax of 2%, also called a UUT, which the Open Space Fund is the beneficiary of. So to actually move that 2%, we'd have to pass, the town council would have to have people vote on reducing the Open Space Fund either temporarily or forever to 0, and then adding the 2% to our 5.5 to make it a 7.5% tax. That's when we say reallocate, that's really what we're talking about.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's mechanics though. I mean,
Yeah.
the pocketbook effect is the same.
They both need to pass.
Sure. Yeah, I get it. Well, you could probably combine it into one, I would imagine, but that's a legal question.
Okay, first, Mark, thanks for all your hard work. I'm very, very impressed. You got a lot further than I did. Since Ken and I worked on the subcommittee for the charter city, I still like the idea of setting that. It would be a way to restore our general fund within a few years, plus pay off the pension liability and the post-retirement benefit liability. I don't think, well, I don't think just reducing our expenses would do that. And according to the town attorney, we cannot vote to become a charter city until the next year, the general election in 2 years from now. And what I proposed the last meeting was to simultaneously enable the town council to reduce the UT annually down to zero, if, well, at least on the, from not necessarily the open space, but down to zero. If we, once we restore everything, so that would, in a way, not be, well, depending on how you look at it, it would not be an increase in tax technically. Mark. And so we would have to survive until January of 27, which is what, a year and a half. And if we need to borrow money from the open space, whatever. Although it sounds like with the current budget, we're okay through then, is that right?
Short-term loans do not solve the problem.
Well, well, I know, but I'm sorry, are we okay through January 1 of 27?
Yes,
Okay, so we can survive without borrowing?
if we adopt the cuts that we're going to be.
So we can survive without borrowing from wherever we need to? Okay,
Yeah, but again, short-term loans do not solve the problem.
Yeah, I'm not. A
no,
fan.
it's, I'm just talking about to get us to January of 26.
And
No,
if needed, we can do.
right, and that's what I'm saying, that, and I would set the rate, of course, we don't have to decide that for a year, for another year and a half. So that we can possibly eliminate the UUT. I feel the same way about taxes as you do, that, and again, just to reiterate the advantage of the transfer taxes, it's not due until your real estate is sold. It's possible you can convince the buyer to pay some of it or split it, pay all of it. And I'm an income tax person. If you're sitting on a huge income tax gain, which I'm sure a lot of you are, the government, the state of California and the IRS are going to fund maybe half of that. I'm meaning you pay less income taxes because it'll reduce your gain. So it's a very tax efficient tax, unlike the UUT, which you pay a little every month, but over 20 years or however long we've been paying it, it adds up. And as our good friend Ed Wells would say, you can't deduct it.
And I also want to mention, as well as looking into billing back our affordable housing fund for the work the state has encouraged us to do on affordable housing, I would also want to look into, I would recommend, if I were on the town council, that somebody fund an attorney or an expert to work with San Mateo on whether it is appropriate for us to renegotiate the deal on our percentage of tax revenue, given they just renegotiated how they do sheriff's contract. And in other contexts, people have heard me wax rhapsodic about asymmetrical negotiations. And this is another example where we're the little low leverage player. And until you punch back, you'll keep getting abused. And I can't help but think that many have observed that we have to pay for sheriff services in our general tax. And the argument that I believe the sheriff's office would use is that, well, but we're getting tax money back to fund a municipality that people in unincorporated San Mateo County don't get. So we get to use part of that to pay for the sheriff. Okay, fine. But now they've totally changed how they ask us to pay expenditures. And we're having the budget effectively doubled in a very short period of time. So I'm wondering if it might be appropriate for us to just re-examine the deal while we do all the cute things that we need to do. It's just something that I'd like to see folks look into. The worst we could do is find that there's no leverage, but maybe there is.
Yeah. So first, I also want to thank Mark. I thought that was a lot of really great work. I don't know how many hours he spent on it, but I think it was more than one. I think maybe as we're going through this, it's good to help start building consensus, which I think you wanted to do, George. And so much of what I have to say is going to be agreeing with what I've heard here today. But I agree, Bill, we need to get this joint meeting. I think that's key, and I think that's a great idea. I think getting the balanced budget done, speaking to what Chris said, assuming no new revenue sources, we have to do that. And I think Mark made the point that the appetite for more new taxes is probably going to be quite low, especially given the situation we're in, and asking the town to trust us that we actually know the numbers now, and this is what it's going to cost to fix it. I think that's maybe a bridge too far. So we absolutely need a budget that assumes no new revenue and maybe no new revenue for quite a while. And those hard choices, I think, need to be made today because we are running out of time. And I think my last point, George, I think that was a great idea that you stumbled upon, however you did, with respect to the housing funds being used to reimburse the town. This is a short-term fix, but it could bridge us to where we need to get to repay or cover the historical costs of the housing element, legal fees, consultants, et cetera. So that would be great. Hopefully we can confirm that that's doable here in the near term. Thanks.
Other comments here at the dais, or can I open it up to comments?
I know that council, my reading of the meeting that I wasn't at, but listened carefully to the recording a couple of times, is that they're moving towards taking the 2%, asking the voters on a simple majority vote in March to allow the 2% that's currently going to the open space fund to instead go to the general fund. That just needs, 50% plus one. That's probably a pretty easy lift if the open space committee endorses it, or at least supports it, because it's not an increase in taxes. The tougher one is, I'm quite certain they're going to think hard about proposing a parcel tax. I think a number of us have done the math with 1,730 taxable parcels with no exemptions. Each $100 per year raises what, 176,000 or something. I think that requires a 2/3 vote. I'm sure we'd all agree that has virtually no chance of happening, given what's happened in town over the last year and a half. I don't think the citizenry is going to have confidence in how things have been managed to this point financially. To go for that, the only way to probably have a reasonable chance of doing that is to, throw some exemptions in there for either equity reasons or because you think you can buy a boat that way. It's hard to get 2/3 for anything. I don't know what kind of exemption you would do that would have an equity purpose. It's not like the school district where people over 65 can get an exemption, because basically they're not using the school district. But then, there's parents that send their kids to private schools. There are people who are 55 who don't have kids. There's a million other people that could be in the mix, but for some reason legally they can do that. But I don't think there would be any chance of passing at 2/3 without some exemptions. You're just not going to get. I think that's kind of a lost cause. I think the only tax thing that could work is the UUT 2%, and then pushing hard on the expenditure cost setting side. I mean, I don't know how much pushback there's going to be from the council on what are we losing from consultants. I don't know what benefit we get from the consultants. I've been told many times over the years that we pay consultants because it's cheaper than paying and hiring people to do the work. But I don't. Christian company, the last town manager had a contract. I think it was at least $135,000. Maybe we got something useful. I mean, Tony maybe knows whether we got something useful out of that. But frankly, their recommendations and things they came back with look like the same stuff that we got in the audit report. I mean, we're already paying for the audit report. So And then we've had a settlement. We've had a lot of other things that we frankly, unfortunately, because of the circumstances, maybe we've wasted some money. I think we've made some bad spending decisions. Hopefully we don't make those again. So I think the solution is going to be kind of a mixed bag of maybe, one reallocation of the UUT expense cutting. And it's gonna be a tough one. I mean, I don't think there's consensus on this group about what we think gotta happen. I'm pretty sure it won't be on the town councils either. But the point is, on anything related to taxes, they're running out of time. They've got, they're gonna have to ponder or just, live with deficits for quite a while.
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to what you said. I also don't think the parcel tax is likely to work. And, we're an entity with a $7.3 million revenue line that's up in 5 years from $5.3 million revenue line. We have a 6% deficit, and we shouldn't be dissolved or go bust over that. We should be able to fix that. And I think reallocating, as we say, the existing tax, that's a nice little slug of money. It doesn't solve our longer term problem with public safety and everything else. But that plus cuts to get to a balanced budget, I think gives us runway to work on Chartertown, a different sort of tax structure that's more tax efficient, as Michelle just indicated, which would be good. As Chris was saying, though, if I'm running a business like this, you have to stop the hemorrhaging of money, because even if in theory it looks like everything is fine, we could have big storms this winter that increase our expenses somehow and drain reserves further. That's happened before. So we can't just assume we'll sail on.
I just want to add one other thing I left out on the parcel tax idea. The other thing you could try to increase the vote for it would be to say the parcel tax can only be used for example, public safety expenditures, which could include sheriff's contract, potentially fire, things like that. That tends to buy you a little bit, I would think, a higher vote. The reality, and I'm sure Tony is familiar with this, is because we went through this on the school district with the parcel tax as well. Money is fungible. So what you do when you receive, let's say the money, let's say we pass a parcel tax, has to be used for public safety. Money comes in, you assign it to the account that goes to the sheriff or the fire or whatever. And then there's something that prevents you from taking the money you would have spent for that from your other general fund and you move it somewhere else. So it's kind of a shell game where you're simply spending the money however you wanted to anyway. You're simply taking it from a different place. We had to do something like that in the school district to try to show, because the rule there says we can't, we actually have to spend a certain way. We have to develop a spreadsheet to prove that we weren't, just simply moving the money around. But on the surface, it probably does pick up an extra 5 or 6 or 7% of support, regardless of what rate you set it at. But I think people want public safety. And again, broadly defined, I think the fire thing that people is worried about is probably I don't think they want to pay more for the sheriff. I think they would pay more for better fire protection or fuel reduction or some of those other things.
Just to add, I mean, that's how it would be proposed. It would be a parcel tax, even though it could go into the general fund. It's a special tax. It would be in its own fund, and it would only have public safety expenses coming out of it. And there'd be an annual report, but it would be by the fund. Not necessarily in the general fund where it's fungible.
And I think these would be time limited. Is that right?
Yes, temporary.
Yeah, so I think that's the proposal, but I think even if the town council doesn't enact that, we need to prudently prepare for one or more not being accepted.
I was just going to comment, another restricted fund, Tony, question mark.
Yes, but
I
it
mean,
would,
these
but
restricted
it's
funds.
for a
we have,
specific purpose. It's for public safety.
Yeah, but
We
we're
put it in that
sitting
fund,
on,
and then we would move the expenses out of the general fund into that fund. So
Yeah,
that
I
takes some
just-
pressure off the general fund.
but you know this, right? I mean, based on the current budget, we're sitting on restricted funds of $16 million, 20. okay, $20 million.
Right, but we would be
Right.
spending this money annually.
I'm just saying, man.
So
You
not
know,
like,
that
not like
I-
the other
I don't want to
funds.
be
This
that
money would be spent annually.
short-sighted. I just think, things
I
change
understand,
over
I understand.
time, right?
Just one other quick point I wanted to make. We talked about this last time, similar to George's idea of using the in lieu funding for the housing element. To the extent we can allocate open space funds for open space related capital expenditures, maintenance, et cetera. We've talked about that. I just wanted to make sure that that's still on the table.
On the table.
So another thing that we haven't talked about at all is reestablishing our reserves. We have quite a few reserves that, like OPEB and pension funds, emergency capital expenditures, et cetera. And so even if we were to balance the budget, we wouldn't be building up reserves. So I think our reserves before were in the $5 million range, 5.5 million perhaps. So even if it takes us 10 years, we need $500,000 a year.
Well, no, we just need to have, for 5 years, a 2.4% higher growth rate of revenue than expenses. That's how we got here.
Yes, that's another way of doing it.
Yeah, exactly. Just if we can if we can just squash expenses slightly more than the natural increase in revenues, we'll be fine. And the problem was we lost that, and it's easy to fix one way or the other in any given year, but it went on for 4 to 5 years, and that created a huge hole.
On the reserve policy, and I read the reserve policy, and I think I understand what its original purpose was. I do wonder, and I do think that so we get assessed taxes as taxpayers annually, except for things like the open space fund, which I completely understand you need to aggregate in order to actually use it at some point. Everything else should actually be spent within the year in which it is actually spent. Otherwise, you then build this reserve fund, and then it becomes a cookie jar. And then you then don't have an audit for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and you know that collectively that there's enough money there to go through it. I'm reasonably confident that had there not been a reserve fund, this problem would have been solved 3 years ago, because it would have had to have been solved 3 years ago. We would not, as a community, had the margin, the buffer to actually skate through for 3 years. I am skeptical about keeping money in a centralized. I'd rather have the money as a taxpayer. It's better spent by me as opposed to even elected officials, but certainly not a government agency. And I think that the reserve policy, as well intended as it was back in the 60s, which was really around for either earthquakes or fires, where no one would be able to pay any property taxes, but the town still to function. It was never meant for a 3-year process where it was simply worked down. I have real reservations about even reestablishing the reserves.
And you may recall that Chris and I had our working group 2 or 3 months back, and our conclusion was we should change the reserve to a range of 25% or something like that, rather than have a single number, which was 60%, which seemed way too high. And the hard floor would be much lower, 25%. And we were thinking of that totally separately from the discussions we're having now, the problems with the budget and everything else. So changing or adopting that as a lower reserve speaks to your issue, which is kind of the moral hazard of having a big reserve. But it was not done as a way to give an excuse for us to be able to spend down money or spend more than we have. It's simply to say we have an over generous, there's a big opportunity cost of having a huge fund like that, and we ought to be able to manage through. The only thing the lower reserve gives up is you have less time to come up with corrective actions. I think you're right. I think we've been protected by having too much time and too much money available, so we weren't as disciplined as we needed to be fiscally on
Well, and frankly, just the fact that the restricted funds that amount to about $20 million between about 12 for open space and 8 for affordable housing mask this whole thing because there's plenty of cash. There was just bad accounting data being entered into the system. And with interest income coming in and what have you, it masked the fact that the general fund balance wasn't nearly as high as we thought it was. And so keeping all of this in one pot is also an issue, right? Because that cash balance sort of made everyone think everything was okay. I think. So I'm very sympathetic to the point you both just made.
George, just want to correct the record. It's 8 million for open space and 4 million for affordable housing.
Oh, I'm sorry. I got that wrong.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Just want to correct.
Okay. It's still a lot.
It is.
Other comments here from the dais before we ask the public to weigh in, and then we can resume talking some more, but they've been waiting patiently a long time. We'll start in the room. We'll start with you, Craig. Oh, can you go to a mic? Yeah, this is Craig Taylor, council member.
So one of the questions was, what is the council looking for? And what I'd suggest is, I think we're looking for two things. We're looking for a short-term fix, if you will. And I think that's sort of roughly on the order of 5 years. Something that gives us time to come up with something more structural going forward. So, I mean, there's a lot of different things that have been talked here, but if they don't pass in 3 years, what are we going to do? So it seems like something on the order of 5 years is kind of the right model. Like, how do we make sure we're viable up to 5 years while we're trying to find a solution? And then a longer term solution. And I'd say there's been great discussion here, and what the council really needs is a summary of this stuff. It really needs to be, and they don't have to be like the finance committee has one recommendation and that's it. You can say, look, we've looked at all these different things. Here's the summary. Here's what you can do. Here are the limitations to those things. But, this has been a broad range of conversations over the last 3 meetings. And I think what they really need now is it needs to get summarized so that the council can see that stuff. And then I think the idea of having a joint meeting is great, but until there's a summary for the council to read, I think you guys are going to come in and say, oh, we've talked about all this stuff. And the council is going to be, well, okay, well, let's start over and explain to us each one. And that won't happen in one meeting. So I think the summary prior to the meeting is critical. So I think that, and then one other comment I have is, we talk about balanced budgets and business. One thing that the town suffers from is we get external mandates that we don't have control over. The state says you're going to do this and you're going to pay for it. And you don't get to say, oh, well, we decided we don't want to do that, so we're not going to pay for it. Like, that's not one of our choices. So having some kind of reserve, I think the comments about the size of it sound just right, but the idea of zero reserve actually sounds wrong to me. So I think as you guys think through that, that's one thing I'd ask as a council member, that you bring some kind of summary to us that basically is pulled together. And again, it doesn't have to be all consistent. It just needs to be, here are all the things we talked about, and here within these areas, the summaries. So, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's really good stuff. Carter, your hand was up first. And just tell everyone online who you are.
I'm the short, fat, bald guy that's in the middle of the picture right now. I'm Carter War. Thank you so much, for your work, Tony. I really appreciate what you're doing. I think this discussion has been very, very fruitful. I think there shouldn't be any new taxes, unless there's new changes, that either improve the lifestyle, of the community, or improve the economic conditions of the town. This is not a structural deficit. I agree with Mark. This has really been, to use an old phrase, you gave a mouse a cookie and they took it all. I really think the analogy, is of the cookie jar is, really apropos. I think, having too many reserves, is, actually a potential problem, unless you're really, really, diligent with that. And then, create alternate, restricted funds to then fund from those, excesses. So that, if you are planning for, earthquake preparedness, or you're planning for, wildland fire problems, or you're planning for, some kind of economic crisis, that those reserves are never held, in the general fund. And I would totally support a cleaning of the account, at the end of, every fiscal year. So you end up with a zero account balance, that then you refill, at the beginning of, the year. I do think, that the major cause, of, the funding imbalance right now, has been in spending money on things, that are not very beneficial to the town, that have been in response to, things that the town has been responding to, as a consequence of the, the affordable housing, efforts required by the state. I think if you went back through, not only this RENA cycle, but the previous RENA cycle, and reimbursed the general fund, with the monies that were spent, on consultants, legal fees, and staff time, I think you'd end up, not having, any deficit, and probably wouldn't even consider, raising taxes, at all, in order to do that. And you would be spending down, the Affordable Housing Fund, but that's essentially what the Affordable Housing Fund, has the ability to do. Because even at the fund balance that it is, it's not enough, to do much of anything, as far as affording the purchase of land, or the, or funding construction. So I think it's, the most responsible thing, that the finance committee and the town council can do, is reimburse itself for those expenses. I'm a little concerned about, the, Steve, your, issue around open space. At the same time, I am on the open space committee, so I probably should recuse myself from, from voting unless I'm voting with my committee. But as a person who enjoys the open space, there hasn't been much funding, from that. We have been funding, a certain amount of, expenditures, over the last couple of years. But if you're going to rob the open space fund, of the tax, I don't think it's also, fair to rob us of, of also, making us take care of, the property. I think it's one or the other. But I don't think there should be any new taxes. I don't think there should be any reallocation, of the taxes, for the open space fund. I think it, it really comes down to reassessing, the organizational chart for the town, and the services that the council, wants to and feels the need to provide. That will, respond to the bulk of the budget issues. The other thing is to go back and renegotiate, all of those long-term service contracts, because I believe there's, some lack of affordability that was afforded because, the fund had too much money. So, when someone made a proposal, it was really easy, for, the town administration to bring that before the council and get approval for it, because there was plenty of money to spend on it. So I think, in general, if the finance committee can take, a more conservative approach from a fiscal standpoint, to say no new taxes, work within what you got, adjust your organizational structure, repay yourself, for the monies that you spend on things, that shouldn't have come from the general fund in the first place. I don't believe, you'd end up in a deficit situation, for the foreseeable future.
Thanks.
Just a quick comment. Thank you, Carter. Just to clarify, my proposal is not to use the open space funds for maintenance that don't relate specifically to the open space. Yeah, that's fine. it was the term rob that I wanted to respond to. So I think the language in the open space documentation, the
Acquisition and preservation of open space.
and yeah, preservation. So that's all I'm asking for. Okay. I'm not hurt.
Not much. Okay. That's true. Anyone else in the room before I turn it online? Okay, we're going to go to online, and Dave Cardinal, you've been extremely patient. Please, you go first.
Thanks, George. First of all, thanks for the shout out and the wonderful presentation on where we are and where we need to go from Mark. Some notes. First of all, as far as the Woodside Fire, we do spend money with them for veg management and chipper, and we don't have to. They don't care, I guess. Well, they better that we were fire safe. We could cut that out in instant. That's not part of our fire protection. It's part of all the people who want us to be more fire safe. Second, I was extremely happy to learn that we could do an occupancy tax without being a charter city. I kind of thought we had to be a charter city. That's huge, but we need to actually decide we want to house someone here with a business that has occupancy. Third, there was some question about the Woodside Sheriff. They basically are paying twice what we do because they want 2 full-time equivalents. Now, each full-time equivalent, weirdly, is 4.5 people because there's 168 hours per week. And so you need like 4+ people, plus overtime, plus vacation, plus this and plus that. And they basically signed on for 2x what we have. So that explains their price. Next, I think the argument about being twice for the sheriff contract is pretty tricky. I don't think we understand the ramifications of being an unincorporated area. Now, I totally agree that from a RENA perspective, it could be a gold mine because San Mateo County has other places to build things, but we would lose all local control. I don't even know how the open space fund would get administered since we're not a town. There'd be no permit desk. I mean, the downsides are, I think, not anything people have really looked at. On the Sharif Sharif termination agreement, I think it's important when we say he didn't work out to remember or learn that basically he kind of thought our working environment sucked and that he was not in a great place and that we, in some way, I think paid him off to go away quietly. So I think that's important for the town council and for everybody else to remember that it wasn't just that, I mean, if he didn't do his job, we could have fired him, but this is a different thing. It's totally private. But I think it's, there's a thing there. I do think the joint meeting with you and the town council is huge, plus. And Ken's point of what services people want and what they want to pay, I think is incredibly important, which relates to the fact that I get that people are whining about their taxes, but we are the second richest zip code in America and maybe the planet. We have maybe $1 trillion worth of property. And if people want services, I don't get it. I don't see why we can't make that happen as long as we have an understanding of where the money goes and how it goes. And finally, my offer, I wish everybody there, I've kind of learned most of your names, but there are no nameplates. I'm totally happy to donate whatever money it takes to make nameplates for all of you so that I have a better idea of who's commenting. So thank you.
Thanks, Dave. And let's see, Dale Fowl, you're next on my screen.
Yes, hopefully you can hear me.
We
Can you hear
can.
me? Great, thank you very much for all of you, your hard work. Particular shout out to Tony, who's doing a yeoman's job, the most transparency I've seen in finance probably since I've been involved with things, which is well over 10 years. So a big shout out there. Two quick comments, and you probably know my opinions, but I firmly believe we've got to have an absolutely balanced budget. That's number one. As George pointed out, revenues are growing very nicely. It's just that expenses are growing faster. So it's very clear we've got to cut expenses. We've got to have a balanced budget. That is how we get through the next 3, 4, 5 years. Balanced budget. Second point is I'm very much in favor of the possibility of taking funds from the in lieu fund to cover some of this. I think if Tony said that his estimate was about 1.1 to 1.2 in consultant fees for the housing element, I think there's probably another $500,000 to $600,000 of legal fees in there. So that brings you right up to about $1.8 million or so that hopefully can be taken from the in lieu fund. You might want to just put that immediately into the reserve along with a balanced budget that gives you some comfort that you can get through the next couple of years before you decide what is next. I also, number three, I am also negative on taxes, and until this ship is righted, I don't think you want to even try to go to the populace to get tax raises. However, a transfer tax as a charter city, I think would be pretty attractive to a lot of folks. And thanks again to all of you.
Thanks, Dale. I see Ronnie Krasinski, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you all for the great work and the presentations today and the discussion. My feeling is that most residents don't want to see services reduced. So, if we have the sheriff's contract expenses increasing and other expenses increasing, we do really need to look at raising revenues. Unfortunately, it seems like our options for doing that are pretty slim, especially if the charter city option couldn't get revenue until 2027. I did have one crazy idea, maybe a bit naive, that I wanted to throw out for raising revenues, and that's to look at a fundraising campaign. If you look at the Portola Valley School Foundation, they raise about 1.2 million per year from 300 families. And, I think it's possible that with the right campaign that we could, raise significant funds that way. I believe it's okay for a town to have donations into the general fund. And then also, I think that those donations would be tax deductible. And so that could be a way to, help sell it to the public as well. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie. That's a new idea. That's one I hadn't thought of. Other comments in the room, online? Yeah, let's talk about, we've got Judy Mendelson. I see you.
Hello, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
So thank you for the time and effort you have put into this. I wanted to comment on the reserve situation. I feel very strongly that both households and organizations need to have reserves. So I would not be in favor of getting rid of reserves, and I do think they need to be built back up. And having been on the school board and having required reserves that we had to use on more than one occasion, I think that 60% of 1 year's annual budget is not an unreasonable amount. And you have unexpected expenses, things come up. Sometimes properties don't turn over in town and your property taxes do not go up by much, so your revenues do not go up as much as one might expect. It's rather uneven from year to year. And so I think my 2 cents is having reserves is very important, and I would like to see that continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. And Karen Askey, you're next.
Hi, all. First of all, thank you very much to Tony and all of you for all of the great work and suggestions. I am completely on board that we have to have a balanced budget. And I also think the UUT transfer of the tax right away is a good idea. And looking into the inclusionary housing fund. And George, to your point, let's see if we can even get that 0.3% in the property tax revenue from the county. There are a lot of great ideas. And one thing that baffles me is that services and supplies line. And I think it would be a public service to provide a greater detail and breakdown of what is in there. Mark did a great job telling us about those top 10 costs. But a question I have related to that is we spent a lot of money on legal fees for the housing element, which I'm assuming were in that services and supplies line. So shouldn't that be going down, those legal fees? And then the last thing I wanted to point out is, or ask is, what has happened with our sales tax revenue with respect to the Alpine Inn in the last few years? We know that they're tremendously successful. I don't think we know how that's impacting our town. And I know we're going to also, with respect to the parking contract for Rosati's Field, that I think they rent out about 100 spaces from us. That contract hasn't been renegotiated in over 10 years. And there could be some low-hanging fruit in the six-figure side of things to look at. And Tony, my request would be when you're working with, I think it's May's consultants on this fees and services, that perhaps that be something that they look at first to see if there is potential there. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. And Betsy, you're next.
Thank you, George, and just thank you for a tremendously thought-provoking presentation, Mark. And again, thank you, Tony, for the kind of transparency we've waited so long to see. So we know the path forward is going to be difficult, but at least we can see the path, or begin to see the path, I should say. About that, I heard at your last meeting, I said that the conduit between the Finance Committee and Town Council was quite broken. It was heartening to hear that at least one of your members attended the recent Town Council meeting, and that there's some effort to start to strengthen that. And again, I was heartened to hear Craig Taylor's request for a summary from the committee, and that time was running short. I think all of those are really constructive, and I would take it one step further, and that is to actually ask the Finance Committee to come up with some recommendations of next steps, because the resident financial expertise is sitting on the dais right now. It is not nearly so strong on the Town Council, so they look to you for the recommendations. You're going to be the people we all look to. So thank you for representing us today and going forward in these challenging months ahead. I know that there's not going to be 100% consensus, but we will get there with your guidance. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. And Dave Cardinal, I see your hands up. Is this from before or is this new?
Sorry, this is new. A real quick comment on the sales tax. You can see that we get 1 penny from the sales tax of 9 pennies. And from what I can tell from looking at the sales tax, we get between $120,000 and $150,000 from ZOTS, and which is great. I just want to chip that in as I think what we're getting from them.
Thank you for that.
George, do you mind if I make a comment?
Is this Sarah?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to share, especially for those of you who are on the dais who likely don't rewatch the meetings on Zoom and can't see who's in attendance. I think the suggestions of a joint meeting are great. I just want to make sure you on the dais and those who are listening are aware that the last 3 meetings have been attended by myself. And other than one meeting, both of the liaisons to the Finance Committee, Craig Taylor and Judith Haskell, have been in attendance. So we do have that through line, just to make sure people are aware of that, especially again, those of you on the dais.
Thank you very much for that. Any other comments?
I don't know how to put my hand up on the Zoom meeting.
Okay, I see it says Maria on the screen, so you're
It is
recognized.
Maria.
Please
And
give
I'm
us
not
your
a
full
bean
name.
counter,
Yeah.
but I grew up in this town, and so I think it's really interesting. And I have a couple of observations, non-technical. First off, one of the things that struck me during your conversations was talking about reallocating or redirecting open space funds. And that kind of concerns me because then you sort of lose track of what the money might be. And I wondered if instead, if it could be a loan from the open space to the general fund. The next thing, and somebody already mentioned this, but one of the things I've been thinking about quite a bit because I've been a little distressed about seeing our current situation, is what sort of structure would be needed for residents to donate to the general fund? And more specifically, I don't quite see how you can cut expenses, especially as they relate to employees in the planning department, the building department, and still do everything that needs to be done to comply with the state in terms of new ADUs or JADUs and all the rest of that. So that's something that I see needs a reality check. And thank you for all your help. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you for the comment. I know enough to be able to answer one part of that, which is loans from open space aren't really much of a solution. Number one, they have to be paid back, but they have to be paid back right away by the end of the same year. What we've been informed. So that's not going to be a practical solution for us. Other comments here before we move on to next steps here? Okay, I don't see any other hands. I'm thinking that it would be good for us to discuss what our next steps are. I really like the idea of writing up a summary of the ideas that we've discussed and sharing that with the town council, with a subgroup of us perhaps doing that offline so that we're not saying we recommend X, but here are the things we discussed. And then use that, as Craig suggested, to potentially get together as a group to talk about it. Interested in what everyone else thinks of that versus making a firm recommendation on this versus that.
When would we have to do this by? It's like there's a meeting in a week, right? Next Wednesday. Would you want
Meeting
that
is
before
on the
then?
23rd, staff reports go out. The agenda will be going out on Friday.
No.
We could move quick. Writing a bullet point kind of summary wouldn't take long. Stephen here has been taking good minutes, and I'm sure between you and me, yeah, he's already done. No, between the two of us, I'm sure we could knock that out in a few days.
I think we should write a summary. And we've had these discussions at length. Let's get a concise summary to town council and get it out.
You can send it to me and I can include it in the staff report.
Okay, and that's going up Friday, you said?
They're gonna.
A week on Friday?
No, Friday.
This Friday?
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, and they're giving me an extra day.
Okay, great, Friday.
To write the staff report.
Sure.
We're extending it for this purpose. Yeah. I can put it in.
Okay, that's fine. You could even send me your raw notes. And I can, yeah. Okay. Great.
Yeah, but we wouldn't meet together next, just get this in.
Yeah, it's just getting everyone something, I think, to read so the town council can see what our latest thinking is, and then we could.
Yeah, what I would expect is that Tony would provide a staff report saying, here's a summary of things from the finance committees, and one of those would be finance committee recommends that we have a joint meeting. And then the council would discuss that and make a decision as a council. And if they approve that, then we'd find a time, mutually agreeable time, and we'd have that meeting. So.
If the two of you write it, can you, again, with these Brown Act rules, can you then distribute it to us and then comment? I mean, I know there's restrictions on.
Yeah, I don't know about the commenting part. I'm sure we can distribute it, but I know.
Oh, the Brown Act. You're on recorded, you're being recorded, Mark.
Let's not do that.
I got it.
But-
We'll,
so
we'll
what
find a
you
way to
could
make it work
do
as a
is
working group. Yeah.
You guys can send comments into George, but you can't you can't all look at something and then review it and then send comments. That is a violation of the Brown Act, and we don't want to do that.
Okay,
I know
this-
it's really frustrating.
So
but-
one recommendation I like to make is make finance committee not be a Brown Act committee. Let's put that in our
I second.
recommendation.
We've actually covered that, crowd. Actually, Craig, that was in the first meeting. Unfortunately, Craig actually, in my perspective, properly interpreted the Brown Act. If you go back and read the Brown Act, as silly as I think it is, we are subject to the Brown Act. And unless we do some kind of weird closed session, which I don't think we really can do, I think we are subject to the Brown Act. I think we have to be practical, however, because I think the consequences of this foot fault is going to be zero.
Let's just not do a foot fault. As a working group, Stephen and I can work on it. I will send it out to everyone. Everyone can send me comments. I won't send any back, and then I'll incorporate.
And you can
And-
have three of you. I mean, you just can't have a quorum,
Okay?
right? So, because you're seven, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, so you could have up to three if that would help.
Yeah.
And listen, I'm on the council, trust me, the Brown Act is extremely frustrating to everybody. I mean, it's important we have public transparency, but it definitely slows down the process. And
Yeah.
for something like this, where we believe that time is of the essence, it's
Yeah.
extremely frustrating.
Well, I'm a
So
big
I-
fan of always having the meeting in the meeting, which is what the intent of the Brown Act is, rather than conferring beforehand and having the meeting. So that isn't what we're doing here. What we just want to do is get an accurate summary of what's been discussed, not miss anything because memories are fallible, and summarize that in a very readable bullet point, kind of easy to digest couple of pages for the town council.
Sorry, I feel like recommendations to the extent we have consensus would be helpful, but I'm not sure this format allows for that.
The summary format wouldn't allow for that. We'd have to do that here,
So
and we could.
when?
Well, we could do it now. I mean, I could, we should talk about it. What I've heard is a fair amount of, I think, enthusiasm for looking into whether we can appropriately charge affordable housing related expenditures from this and prior years to the appropriate fund, the restricted fund for affordable housing. So that would be one, right?
Putting together a balanced budget, assuming no new revenue. I believe there's consensus for that.
Okay. Anyone who objects, please do so. That's how I'll run this. So
Could you repeat that comment about the balanced budget?
That the town put together a balanced budget that assumes no new revenue sources.
For how, just this year?
Well, certainly for this year. I think probably this year and next year.
Yeah, through January of 27.
I think the reality is, talked about, I don't think we all agree on this committee what we ought to do. And I don't think we have time to, or should make efforts to build a consensus about what seven of us think. I think we need to present the arguments and the information that we've talked about here directly to the council. They're the ones that are stuck with the job of making a decision. So I don't think we want to take extra time trying to, soften our edges on what we feel is right, just so we can have a single thing to come to the council with. That's not the purpose of the meeting I suggested, is to have open dialogue with, those 5 people and the 7 people here that have thought about this, and we can talk back and forth. I think some kind of summary document so they know the types of things we've talked about. I don't think we have to come to an agreement or a recommendation. I would like them to be in the summary to know that, our working group suggested that our reserve requirement should be in a range and the hard limit ought to be 25% of our expenditures, not 60%. But, 3 people on this committee might agree with that and 4 don't, but we don't have to negotiate that to put it in a document that we can talk to the council about. We can let them debate that.
My assumption was they might benefit and appreciate our recommendations, but if that's not feasible, that's why I asked the question, how we would actually incorporate that.
Look, my recommendation would be that we nominate 3 people to write this. And, and I think presenting every option that we've discussed over the past however many meetings to the town council is just going to lead to more delays and confusion. So why don't we just agree on who are the 3 people who could write it, put our recommendation forward, and then if we want to have a town council meeting, if they accept the meeting, then we do it that way. What do you think? I'm willing to pick 3 here. Are we not willing to pick 3 people to author this?
I mean, you're saying to come up with a recommendation. as
Come
opposed
up
to
with a
summary.
recommendation, because you know what? I think people really, we need to stop just presenting opinions and come up with a recommendation for town council to consider, because there's a lot of stuff to sort through.
Yeah,
People all been sorting through it. So I mean, why not just pick 3 people? I mean, George is the chair. I mean, he should chair it, for sure. And then,
I don't think we can just have 3 people to make recommendations on behalf of the finance committee. I think it has to be the finance committee.
oh,
We can
But
we
we
can have 3
can't
people
review
write a
those.
summary.
Well, if you want, you can take 5 minutes now. You can name the 5 or 6 top specific things we've talked about and just force a vote. And just record the vote and report that to the
We
council.
could do that. I mean, and what I heard Stephen saying wasn't that we're adopting a balanced budget, but that one should be prepared, right? Because we hear that we may have to reduce services to balance the budget. Okay, and you have to reduce activities, not just headcount and all that kind of stuff. But what would that entail? And unless we go through the exercise, I don't know that town council knows what that would entail. And it might be unacceptable at the level of people want to vote to raise their taxes. That's okay. Or maybe it is what they need to do, but I think we have to think about it.
So let me suggest something.
Okay.
I think there's general consensus that partial tax is not likely to pass. And therefore it may not be worth the effort, and particularly given the short deadlines that we have to do that in a timely manner. However, a real property transfer tax has a higher probability of passing. And so if we believe that, we have to fund the short term. And the short term is actually all the way through January of 2027 at a minimum, because we would vote in 26, in November of 26. And so therefore, to give us this short term, we would, 1, need to decrease services, 2, reallocate, to use the term I don't like, the 2% UUT from open space, add internet service to it as well to pick up some amount of money. 3, attempt or think about fundraising. And 4, investigate the possibility of a loan. Either a multi 3-year or whatever loan that could be from a commercial organization, or it could be some private residents. Particularly if we could use some of our restricted funds as collateral, which I doubt is legal.
I think I'd rather charge the HCD fund, the housing element expenses to the affordable housing fund.
Oh, I think that should be done
Okay.
as the first thing.
I'm not sure I'm up for the vig of a 3-year loan.
I was picking her up. I pulled into the parking spot and I go.
Okay.
Personally, I believe Tony said that without the 300,000 from the open space, the 2%, even without that, you think we can get to January of 2027? Is that right?
It would be close. It would be too close.
Too close?
Yeah. But if we can allocate some of the housing element costs to the open space fund, then that will greatly alleviate some pressure.
Yeah, I personally don't want another election in March for just the little town of us. For 300,000, I would hope we could cut expenses to get us to January of 2027.
And Craig?
I was just gonna say, I mean, if you guys have a recommendation, you can get to it easily. I think that's great. But even without that, I think just saying, if you do, if you balance the budget for the next 2 years, the consequences are this, pros and cons. And same thing with, if we take it out in lieu, just go through these things. Because as a council member, that's what I'm going to be looking at. I mean, eventually the council is going to have to make this decision. So getting pros and cons is actually more important to me than the finance committee recommended this. Like that's great. I appreciate, but the reality is that it's really the thinking behind the recommendation that's more critical. And I think that was your point as well. It's really about the thinking that's critical that gets to the council. And I think if we have the joint meeting, that summary is going to then let us dig into the sort of thinking, so to speak.
Okay, that's helpful. I'm happy to work on that with you, but I don't know about the group of 3. I mean, if somebody else wanted to help too, that's fine. Okay. Chris, do you want to help?
Any volunteers? Ken?
I don't either. I'm super overwhelmed, but this is important, so I think.
If anybody wants me to do it, I'll make the time.
Sure, that'd be better.
All right.
So this is going to be Chris, Stephen, and me. We're going to summarize these things. We'll circulate it to everyone for one-way comments inbound to me, so we don't violate any laws.
So we can send it out for one-way comments?
That's what I think Craig said.
Just to be clear, the entire committee can send comments to you.
Right.
You can't send a document to people and get comments back.
Oh, I
Like,
can't.
You can't do that, Lou.
Oh, I see. I
Yeah.
can't do that loop. So
No,
the
I-
document can only go out when it's final. It can't go out and then come back.
But
So-
everybody can write up there, like, here are the,
Okay.
things and here are the pros and cons.
Right.
And then you can kind of combine them all together.
Okay, if anyone, you heard that, if anybody has your hot thing, like your top 2 things, don't forget this, let me know.
Yeah,
And
that would be helpful.
That would be great.
George got some new information about Marina or
Okay.
how apparently there's a policy. There's the city has a affordable house policy. Funding requests shall be considered given priority to the following: identifying, funding the acquisition of, and funding the construction of affordable units on housing element opportunity sites or alternative sites that contribute to meeting the RENA obligations of the housing element on an equivalent basis, with input from the Planning Commission and the Architectural and Site Control Commission or other boards or commissions the town council deemed appropriate. Projects that would enable developers to support or increase the percentage of units in a project that are for very low and low income households, and other projects for which the town council determines will have the greatest impact in addressing the town's affordable housing needs consistent with the town's general plan. A report needs to be submitted and input from the Planning Commission and the Architectural and Site Control Commission or other boards and commissions the town council deems appropriate for approval by the town council. The report should contain a summary of the current fund status, assessment of project consistency with this policy, and a review of project documentation, pro forma, and other reports demonstrating project and applicant readiness and capability.
Is is the summary that at least, and you got that feedback that says that the town can use the in lieu funds, of which there's approximately 4 million for the purposes of paying for some of these housing element expenses? Is that what I heard?
It said identifying, funding the acquisition of, and funding the construction of affordable units on housing element opportunity sites or alternative sites that contribute to meeting the RENA obligations of the housing element on an equivalent basis, with input from the Planning Commission and the Architectural and Site Control Commission or other boards or commissions the town council deems appropriate.
Can you share that? A link to that with everyone.
But it said the monies can be used to provide funding for pre-development and construction expenses necessary to create new affordable housing, purchase land directly, or provide funding to affordable housing developers or community land trusts to purchase suitable sites to build affordable housing, engage experts, consultants, or advisors with demonstrated experience in the development of affordable housing projects to evaluate the feasibility of potential affordable housing sites, projects, or funding programs under a developed site and building designs that reflect an appropriate affordable housing project on such sites. Provide funding for purchase and or rehab of existing multifamily housing for conversion to deed restricted affordable housing. Support the development and construction of accessory dwelling units and junior accessory dwelling units for low or very low income households with a recorded deed restriction of 55 years. Fund efforts to streamline affordable housing processes in Portola Valley. Provide funding assistance to other agency or housing development corporations through loans, including equity participation loans, grants, pre-home ownership, co-investment, participation leases, or other public-private partnership arrangements. Other affordable housing opportunities as they may arise and the town council deems appropriate. Number 2, cover reasonable administrative expenses not reimbursed through processing or other fees, including reasonable consultant and legal expenses related to the establishment and or administration of the fund. Reasonable expenses for administering the process of calculating, collecting, accounting for in lieu and housing impact fees, and town administrative costs for the development, permitting, and the ongoing monitoring of affordable housing projects constructed with monies from the fund.
So Tony, that policy was written to fund projects, like because people would come to us and say, we want money from this fund, and we said, we don't have a policy, so we came up with that policy. I think what you guys, which is fine, but I think what you guys are proposing is something different, which is, can we pay for the actual RENA, the definition of a housing element?
Right.
And I think that's going to have to come to the council. So I think this is sort of a different, this policy was intended to do something different and certainly written before we were going, we need to figure out where money is. So I think you guys should proceed. The council may say, no, we're sticking with that policy. That's a different issue.
Sure.
But I wouldn't use that policy to prevent your
Right.
suggestions from moving forward.
Yeah, that's great, because, our suggestion, I think, would be to seriously consider the appropriateness of saying, all right, we have $4 million. It's here to try to create more affordable housing, and the state has required us to spend a lot of money to create a comprehensive plan on how we do just that. So it seems to match the intent of the fund from a naive layperson standpoint, so.
And the council would be able to modify that policy. Is that correct
Yeah,
assumption?
that is a council policy.
That's
So the
council
council,
policy, yeah.
yeah. And the same thing's true at the open space. I mean, we have a policy about maintenance, which is we don't use the acquisition fund for maintenance. So if we were to do that, then in the same way, the council would have to make a decision that we were going to override the policy that we've agreed that previously. So UUT, the language in the UUT talks about preservation, but we actually had a policy that came to the council when I was on the Open Space Committee 10-ish years ago, much like the in lieu housing fund policy on how you could spend that money. So these are just policies within the town. They're not there. The council can do what they want relative to those, but they're going to take that into consideration.
Thanks, that's really helpful.
Okay, then just to summarize, so by Thursday, you'll have time?
I don't,
For
but
your
I'll,
second job, thank you,
I'll,
thank you.
I'll try to write up something tonight, and I'll share that with you, because I can do that. We can work on this together on Thursday, and then, thank you. All right, great. And,
So then you three will come to some summary,
yes.
distribute that to us?
No.
No, no.
You can't Ixnay on distribute nay.
Wait, they can distribute it to us, right? No?
No. Yeah, you'll see it. You'll see it, but it'll be too late.
So if it's distributed, it should be distributed as a public document.
Okay, great.
So that's the point, that you need to be careful. I mean, that's why the meeting works, is as long as it's in your agenda for a meeting, it becomes a public
Yeah,
document.
right. So we'll get it to Tony. Tony will put it in the packet. That way the whole town sees it, the town council sees it.
And you'll see it at that
And
time.
you will see it. And if you don't like something or we left something out, well, that's great. At the meeting, you will show up and make that clear.
In the meantime, we can email you with
Yeah.
what we wanted.
People can hurl bricks in my direction. That'll be great. Yeah, and in the meantime, let me know what you want in it.
Or you can take my spot.
That's right.
So when do we think we actually might have a joint meeting with the council? What are the possibilities? I want to make sure I look at my calendar and make sure I'm here for that.
So,
It's every other Wednesday, correct?
so basically it's the second and fourth Wednesday. Occasionally we've done a fifth Wednesday. But that's basically the mayor is got to look at the roll forward and decide where this fits in. So
So if there's going to be an election, you have to have that by December 6th. So this has to happen well before that, right? So it's
Right.
probably next month.
yeah, so I think this is, what we're talking about is if Tony can get it in the staff report, then we can have a discussion at the next town council meeting about when we're going to have a joint meeting.
Okay.
But it's not, I can't tell you when that joint meeting would be. That's not in my purview as an
But-
individual council.
But it could
member.
get discussed next Wednesday.
Exactly. We could we as a body could make a decision next Wednesday on when we would have that meeting.
And one of us could maybe call in or go to that meeting to reinforce why we think it's important to physically get together.
Absolutely. And
Okay.
you all could be there. And it doesn't, George can be your spokesperson, but it doesn't have to be George.
Sure.
Like you could show up and say, I was pushing this idea and here's why. And that's great.
Yeah, George is looking for things to do, I know.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, so you normally meet on the first and third Wednesdays, so that,
It's second and fourth.
second and fourth, so,
But we are, at the end of the year, we're not having two meetings on the regular schedule in November.
not, so
Well,
what,
the fourth Wednesday is the day before Thanksgiving.
oh, okay, but,
December, we're having one meeting in December, and we've got the election. But there are some special meetings coming up. But those are for specific topics. We don't want to add on to those. I think the regular scheduled meeting that we just went over this morning, but there's one regular meeting in November and one regular meeting in December. So the November meeting is, if we are going to declare a fiscal emergency, that would be the meeting that we would do that.
so that would be like the 13th?
I
of
believe
November?
so.
That's the second Wednesday.
Yeah, I believe so.
But just to be clear, if we, as a council, agree that we want to have a joint meeting, we can have that any day we want with sufficient notice.
Right.
So we're not stuck with the second and the fourth. That's going to be most convenient because everybody's got their schedules lined up. But if we're really under a deadline here, we can choose to do it, in a week and a half, if that's what the council decides.
Yeah.
Whereas I think there's other stuff that we do have to have at a regularly scheduled meeting. So, we need to be careful of separating that. But in terms of, I think, a joint meeting, that's going to be a matter of a council decision.
Okay, great. I think what we know, what our immediate next steps are, we're going to do a summary. We're going to get it to Tony so he can get it to the public and the town council. And then we are going to let the town council decide when they'd like to all get together with all of us.
Yeah, but
to
do we
talk
need
about this.
to agree that we agree with your summary?
Well, I don't think so. I think we've agreed that Stephen and Chris and I will prepare a summary. And we're not making recommendations saying the council
okay.
loves this. We're going to say the council discussed this. Here's the pros, here's the cons. And as long as we get it about right, I think we'll be fine. And if you don't like things, turn up and explain what you don't like, and that'll be great. We got to make progress. That's the point.
It'll probably be me making the recommendations.
Say again?
It'll be me making the recommendations, but
Okay.
I will be taking into consideration.
Brilliant.
with
Okay,
The finance committee, I will be presenting
great.
the arguments, and I'm gonna have a whole slew of options.
Okay,
And so it may not be all of finance committees where I'm thinking that the consensus is going. But I will be making recommendations and I will include all pertinent information that the council needs in order to make that determination.
okay, sounds really good.
Okay.
I think we are not, once again, not going to get to the second agenda item today. So I think we've exhausted this in our time. Let's see, in terms of the agenda, what is the other, is there another agenda item besides what we're not going to cover? We're going to defer, right?
It's
So we-
just the-
Did
the
you
act-
approve your minutes?
The act,
We did.
Okay.
So are we gonna,
the audit report.
Yes, and we're tabling
Yeah.
that without any
are
objection.
we gonna talk about our next meeting or just wait?
I think we should
Just wait
schedule that when we know more.
with the council?
Okay,
Okay.
yeah, we don't have to schedule that right this second. So I think that concludes all of our business. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Also move.
In favor? Any opposed? Okay, meeting is adjourned at 6:38.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. I can do it. I'll have to do it tonight. Oh, yeah.